Good evening. Let's begin tonight not with a headline, but with a principle of physics. Every structure, whether it's a bridge, a skyscraper, or a war, has a breaking point. You can hide cracks with speeches. You can paint over stress fractures with propaganda. But there is always a precise moment when the weight of reality overwhelms the strength of the lie. And tonight, that moment has arrived for Vladimir Putin's war. For nearly 4 years, the Kremlin has tried to defy geopolitical gravity. First, we were told the invasion would take 3 days, then 3 weeks, then 3 months. Then it quietly became as long as it takes. But here we are now, late December 2025, and the foundation of that war is no longer just cracking, it is dissolving under pressure. Not because of a dramatic battlefield collapse in eastern Ukraine, not because of a sudden territorial breakthrough, but because of an unexpected move far from the front lines in waters Moscow believed were untouchable. While much of the world was fixated on maps of the Donbass and frozen trench lines, something far more consequential happened beyond the borders of Ukraine. In the open waters of the Mediterranean, a place the Kremlin treated as safe, invisible, and economically essential, Ukraine struck at the hidden machinery keeping Russia's war alive. And almost simultaneously, a revelation emerged from the White House, a casual admission from President Trump that, once you hear it, changes how you understand everything that came before. Because it turns out, the discussion on the table right now isn't really about peace. It isn't a ceasefire. It isn't diplomacy in the traditional sense. What's unfolding looks far more like a liquidation, a controlled sell-off of territory, leverage, and principles designed to stabilize a collapsing system before it fully gives way. And tonight, we have the receipts. We can show you who stands to gain, who stands to lose, and why this moment may mark the most dangerous phase of the war yet. So tonight, we're not starting with Ukraine's eastern front. We're not starting with Moscow. We're starting with a single strike in a place Putin never expected to be hit, and a political confession in Washington that explains exactly why that strike mattered. For years, one assumption sat quietly at the center of Moscow's war planning: containment. The belief that Ukraine could be boxed in, limited by geography, starved by blockades, and forced to fight only on terrain the Kremlin had already calculated and fortified. As long as the front lines stayed frozen in eastern Ukraine, the thinking went, Russia's deeper economic arteries, its oil flows, its shadow shipping routes, its offshore logistics would remain untouched. That illusion collapsed in a single moment on December 19th. In neutral waters of the Mediterranean, far from Ukrainian territory and well outside what Moscow considered the active war zone, a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker was struck. Not by a NATO missile, not by a submarine, not by a Western airstrike. It was hit by an advanced Ukrainian long-range aerial drone, a weapon that should not have been able to reach that far, that accurately, that cleanly. And that's exactly why it mattered. These Shadow Fleet tankers are the financial backbone of Russia's war economy. They are ghost ships, often uninsured, poorly documented, and deliberately opaque, used to bypass sanctions and keep oil revenue flowing into the Kremlin's war machine. For years, they operated under the assumption of invisibility. No flags, no headlines, no accountability, and suddenly one of them was burning in open water, broadcast across intelligence networks in real time. This was not just a tactical strike. It was a strategic message. Ukraine was demonstrating that containment was over, that borders no longer defined the battlefield, that distance no longer guaranteed safety. By hitting a target Moscow believed was untouchable, Ukraine exposed a far more dangerous reality for the Kremlin. The war was no longer limited to trenches and artillery duels. It had reached into Russia's wallet. According to intelligence assessments circulating tonight, Russia's entire 2026 military budget assumed uninterrupted operation of these shadow shipping routes. They were the quiet constant in an otherwise deteriorating economy. Remove their safety, and the math collapses. This is no longer pressure. It is systemic risk, the kind that doesn't bleed slowly, but triggers cardiac arrest. And here's the irony. While Putin stood before cameras projecting confidence, insisting everything was going according to plan, the real damage wasn't happening on land. It was happening in spreadsheets, shipping logs, insurance risk models, and classified briefings scrambling to answer a single question. If the Mediterranean is no longer safe, where exactly is? Because the moment that tanker burned, the war changed shape. Ukraine wasn't just fighting for territory anymore. It was attacking the assumption that Russia could outlast everyone else economically. And once that assumption breaks, everything built on top of it begins to wobble. Once the illusion of containment shattered in the Mediterranean, the next layer of the war began to unravel the numbers. Because when you strip away speeches, parades, and carefully staged press conferences, wars are ultimately judged by math. Territory gained, resources spent, lives lost. And tonight, the data tells a story that Moscow cannot spin its way out of. According to internal assessments now circulating among Western intelligence agencies, Russia's military advances since January 2025 amount to an average of just 176 square miles per month. To put that into perspective, that's not a province. It's not a city. It's the size of a handful of outer suburbs, scorched, cratered, and strategically marginal. And the cost of those gains is staggering. Nearly 790,000 Russian troops killed or severely wounded in less than a year. That's not a statistic. That's the near total population of a major American city, fed piece by piece into the machinery of attrition. This is where the Kremlin's narrative collapses under its own weight. A successful military strategy trades lives for decisive outcomes. What Russia is executing now trades lives for time, and increasingly, not even much of that. Every mile gained is purchased at a cost that compounds faster than the state can replace manpower, equipment, or political legitimacy. This is not momentum. It is exhaustion disguised as progress. And exhaustion is lethal for autocracies. Because unlike democracies, they rely on the perception of inevitability. Strength must appear endless. Sacrifice must feel purposeful. But when casualty numbers spike while gains shrink, the illusion begins to crack, not publicly at first, but internally. Inside recruitment offices, inside regional governments, inside families who are no longer asking if their sons will return, but when the notice will arrive. The deeper problem for Putin is that these losses coincide with economic pressure he cannot offset. Oil revenues are down, borrowing costs are rising. And the shadow fleet, the quiet workaround meant to keep the war funded, has just been exposed as vulnerable. That combination is toxic. Historically, Russian regimes don't collapse because of one decisive battlefield defeat. They collapse when the gap between official victory claims and everyday reality becomes impossible to ignore. We've seen this before. In 1917, the Russian Empire didn't fall because it lost every battle. It fell because breadlines spoke louder than proclamations. Because soldiers stopped believing the sacrifice was worth it. Because numbers, not slogans, told the truth. And tonight, those same warning signs are flashing again. Putin's war plan is shaken not because he has run out of rhetoric, but because he is running out of two things every autocrat depends on: money and disposable humans. And when those limits come into view, desperation follows. Just as Moscow was scrambling to assess the damage from the Mediterranean strike and the hemorrhaging numbers on the battlefield, a second shock landed, this one, not from a drone, but from a microphone in Washington. Over the weekend, in what appeared at first to be a casual exchange with reporters, Donald Trump made a remark that fundamentally altered the meaning of everything unfolding in Ukraine. He expressed frustration that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had not yet read a new 28-point peace proposal, a plan quietly drafted with Russian participation. But it wasn't the complaint that stunned observers, it was the phrasing that followed. Trump said, almost offhandedly, "Russia's fine with it. His people love it." Think about that sentence for a moment. Russia's fine with it. Of course Russia is fine with it, because the contents of that plan read less like a compromise and more like a victory Moscow failed to secure on the battlefield. According to details now circulating among diplomatic and intelligence channels, the proposal demands that Ukraine cede the entire Donbas region, including areas still under Ukrainian control. It requires a constitutional ban on NATO membership, a hard cap on the size of Ukraine's military, and perhaps most astonishing, the unfreezing of Russian assets seized by the international community to help rebuild the very country Russia destroyed. This is not conflict resolution. This is retroactive reward. What makes this moment so explosive isn't just the substance of the plan, it's the admission that it was negotiated without Ukraine even at the table. The President of the United States openly acknowledged a deal that Moscow supports, while the democratically elected leader of Ukraine had not yet agreed to read it. This wasn't diplomacy conducted in public view. It was a closed-door transaction between powerful men deciding the fate of a sovereign nation, and the timing matters. This revelation comes precisely as Vladimir Putin finds himself in a window of extreme vulnerability, militarily overstretched, economically strained, and suddenly exposed far beyond his borders. The question then becomes unavoidable. Why would Washington push so aggressively for a deal that gives Putin nearly everything he wants at the exact moment his position is weakening? The answer, as we'll see next, has very little to do with peace and everything to do with leverage, resources, and a quiet transactional logic reshaping foreign policy behind the scenes. To understand why this peace plan exists at all and why it looks so one-sided, you have to stop thinking about it as diplomacy and start seeing it as a transaction. Because when we trace the origins of this 28-point framework, when we followed the paper trail through policy briefings and quiet discussions in Washington, one word kept resurfacing again and again: minerals. Buried beneath eastern Ukraine is one of Europe's most valuable concentrations of rare earth resources: lithium, titanium, graphite, the raw materials that power electric vehicles, advanced weapons systems, and the next generation of global industry. Trillions of dollars worth. And according to multiple sources familiar with the negotiations, there is a parallel document circulating alongside the peace proposal, a framework agreement outlining mutual economic benefit through access to these mineral deposits. This is the pivot. The war, in this view, isn't just something to be ended, it's something to be settled. Territory becomes leverage. Sovereignty becomes a bargaining chip. The Donbass isn't treated as a homeland, but as a future extraction zone. If Russia gets the land and Western partners get access to the resources, the logic goes, then everyone with power walks away satisfied. Everyone, that is, except the people who actually live there. This explains the chilling indifference embedded in the plan. Constitutional bans, military caps, frozen assets returned as goodwill gestures. These aren't concessions made in the name of stability. They are the price of admission for a deal designed to stabilize a collapsing authoritarian regime long enough to make the numbers work. It's why Moscow is fine with it. It's why urgency suddenly replaced patience in Washington. And it's why Ukrainian consent feels almost optional in the process. But here's the fatal flaw in that logic. You cannot negotiate away a war of national survival like a distressed real estate asset. Ukraine has spent 4 years learning painfully that agreements with Vladimir Putin are not endings, only pauses. The idea that a population that has buried tens of thousands of its own would accept a settlement written around mining rights reveals a profound misunderstanding of what this war has become. And that misunderstanding is already sending shockwaves across Europe. According to diplomatic reporting, NATO capitals are reeling. For the first time since 1945, European leaders are openly discussing a future security architecture that does not assume American leadership. Not because Europe wants distance, but because trust is eroding. All of this, the mineral deals, the rushed peace framework, the sidelining of Ukraine, is happening while Russia is weakest. Which raises the most dangerous question of all. What happens when an autocrat facing decline is offered a lifeline instead of defeat? At first glance, the contradiction seems impossible to reconcile. How can a White House publicly push a peace plan that looks like surrender while Ukraine simultaneously executes some of the most sophisticated long-range strikes of the entire war? The answer lies in what officials are not saying, and in a policy operating with two faces at once. Publicly, the message is negotiation, freeze the lines, end the war, stabilize the region. But behind the scenes, something very different has been unfolding since early October. According to reporting corroborated by defense officials and intelligence sources, Donald Trump quietly authorized what is known as enhanced high-fidelity intelligence, sharing a technical phrase that masks an enormous shift. In modern warfare, high-fidelity targeting data is the difference between a drone being symbolic and a drone being decisive. For years, the most sensitive real-time coordinates of Russian energy infrastructure, especially assets deep inside Russian territory or in neutral waters, were withheld over fears of escalation. That restraint ended on October 2nd. The leash was cut. Suddenly, Ukrainian planners weren't just guessing where to strike, they were threading needles across hundreds of miles with precision once reserved for superpowers. This is where the strategy reveals itself. The peace plan isn't designed to end the war through compromise. It's designed to end it through leverage. By helping Ukraine set Russia's economic rear areas on fire, the shadow fleet, offshore platforms, protected production zones, Washington is increasing the cost of refusal to unbearable levels. The message to Moscow is brutal in its simplicity. Sign the deal or watch the foundations of your economy burn. And the cynicism of this approach is staggering. You arm Ukraine with the intelligence to cripple Russian oil flows. You allow strikes that freeze double-digit percentages of production in a single afternoon. And then you sit across from Vladimir Putin and offer him a way out, land legitimacy, and economic oxygen in exchange for compliance. Peace, in this framework, isn't the goal. It's the product being sold after maximum damage has been inflicted. But here's what this double game ignores. Wars of national survival do not respond predictably to pressure. Ukraine's strikes are not just bargaining chips. They are statements of intent. When Ukrainian drones reach into the Mediterranean, into the Caspian, into spaces Russia believed were inviolable, they are signaling something far more dangerous for negotiators: that Kyiv retains the capacity to make any imposed peace as costly as continued war. What was meant to be a controlled squeeze is becoming uncontrollable escalation. And that brings us to the final turn, the moment Ukraine made its own position unmistakably clear, not with words, but with fire. The strike that ignited the Mediterranean wasn't just a tactical success. It was a declaration, a line drawn not only against Moscow, but against anyone who believed Ukraine's future could be negotiated without Ukraine's consent. When Ukrainian drones reached more than 1,000 miles beyond their borders, threading precision strikes through airspace once considered untouchable, the message was unmistakable. This war is no longer confined by the rules others want to impose. For decades, the Caspian Sea, the Mediterranean routes, and Russia's offshore energy infrastructure functioned as protected rear areas, strategic sanctuaries where the Kremlin stored resilience. That illusion is gone. Ukrainian strikes froze production, rattled insurers, spiked risk premiums, and forced Moscow to confront a reality it had spent years denying: geography no longer guarantees safety. Distance no longer equals immunity. This is where the peace calculus collapses, because Ukraine's capability now outpaces the assumptions embedded in any imposed settlement. You can sign documents in Washington, you can agree on maps in Moscow, but you cannot compel a nation that has learned how to reach your economic lifelines to accept a peace that secures its own vulnerability. The drone strikes were not pleas for leverage, they were proof of independence. And the timing is everything. Russia is spending close to 1/10 of its GDP on a war it is not winning. Oil revenues are down sharply. Borrowing costs are rising. Casualties have hollowed out the manpower base. In moments like this, autocrats do not seek fair resolutions, they seek lifelines. What's being offered under the banner of peace is exactly that: stabilization for a collapsing system paid for with someone else's sovereignty. Ukraine's response has been brutally clear. If you attempt to freeze this war on terms written elsewhere, Ukraine retains the means to make that freeze unstable, expensive, and dangerous. The strike wasn't escalation for its own sake. It was deterrence aimed as much at boardrooms and briefing rooms as at command centers. The deeper failure here isn't only Moscow's. It's the belief that democracy can be managed through transactions with those trying to dismantle it. History shows where that leads. Not to peace, but to postponement. Not to stability, but to sharper, wider conflict down the line. The war plan is shaken because the world is finally seeing the truth behind the curtain. An empire running out of money, running out of people, and running out of places to hide, while the people it tried to subdue have learned how to reach everywhere that matters. By the time the smoke cleared over the Mediterranean, one truth had become impossible to ignore. This war is no longer being decided only on battlefields or at negotiating tables. It is being decided in the space between reality and illusion, and that illusion is collapsing fast. The belief that Vladimir Putin could outlast Ukraine through endurance alone is gone. The assumption that Ukraine could be pressured into silence through closed-door deals has evaporated. And the idea that peace can be engineered by trading land for leverage is proving dangerously flawed. We are now entering the most unstable phase of the conflict. Russia is weaker than at any point since the invasion began, and more dangerous precisely because of that weakness. Ukraine is stronger, more capable, and increasingly unwilling to accept solutions that treat its survival as negotiable. And the international system is being forced to confront a hard question. Will it defend democratic agency or attempt to manage authoritarian decline through transaction and delay? History offers a warning here. Cracks don't heal themselves. Pressure doesn't simply fade away. When reality outweighs fiction, structures either adapt or collapse. The Mediterranean strike was not the end of this story. It was the moment the old assumptions stopped working. The war plan is shaken because the illusion holding it together can no longer carry the weight placed upon it. So the question now is simple and unavoidable. Will the world adjust to this reality or continue pretending the structure is stable until it fails completely?